Okay, next up, we have Baraka Blue. He'll be leading our next workshop on Unleashing Your Potential, and it's entitled Finding Meaning and Direction. So welcome, Baraka.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين. السلام عليكم. ما شاء الله. Alhamdulillah, they didn't give you any break, so you have to be very patient with me, inshallah. And it is very cold in here. Hope you brought your jackets. It feels a little bit like where I'm from. I'm from Seattle. I grew up in Seattle. It's called the City of the Rain. And apparently everybody, when I say I'm from Seattle in Malaysia, they say, oh, Nirvana. Pearl Jam. So grunge is very big here, apparently. And Seattle is the mecca of grunge, if you can say that. So alhamdulillah, the topic today is unleashing potential, finding meaning and direction. That was the topic that was given to me. I don't claim to know everything about unleashing potential or finding direction and meaning. That would be a little presumptuous on my part. But I wanted to start off by asking a question. Raise your hand if you feel like you've attained your full potential in life. That there's no way that you can improve. Nobody? Alhamdulillah. In preparing some reflections on this topic, I thought about that question, and I thought that it's a very unique situation that the human being is in. Because I think of course, it's difficult. It's more difficult unless you're Dr. Dolittle. It's very difficult to communicate with animals. But I don't think dogs or cats or falcons or whales sit around and think, I'm sure not at my full potential right now. But one day I'm going to get there. It's a very human thing. I think it's unique to the human experience that we feel no matter what we may accomplish, no matter what our strengths, we always feel that there's a way that we could improve. And we always acknowledge that there's a way that we fall short. And this is something that's interestingly true, not just for those of us who may be the common folks, but this is actually true for even the greatest amongst the scholars and the knowers of Allah. I mentioned in my performance yesterday that I became Muslim. I became Muslim 12 years ago. And how do you call it here? Mat Saleh. Mat Saleh, right? I'm learning some Malay words. So alhamdulillah, one thing that you find when you're a convert to Islam is that born Muslims always come up to you and say, MashaAllah, you're so much better than us. You converted to Islam. And that's not necessarily true. But I see what they're saying. I understand what they're saying because I've been around a lot of converts, especially being in America. And you go into communities that are almost all converts, different backgrounds. Black, white, Latino, Filipino, all backgrounds. Very beautiful. And then I've traveled around the Muslim world as well and seen the way that Islam manifests in different cultures, from Senegal to Nusantara to Turkey to Arabia and beyond. And one of the things that seems to be clear is that most Muslims that are born Muslim, they just look at Islam as something that they are. It's like an identity. In the sense, and again, I remarked yesterday, if we use the analogy of a map, because life is a journey. And ad-deen an-nasiha, as the Prophet ﷺ said. The deen is advice. The deen is, another way you could say it, the deen is a map. Okay, take a left here, take a right here. This is how you get to the destination. Avoid this area. But a lot of people that are born Muslim, they just like frame the map on their wall, so to speak. They have the Quran prominently displayed on the shelf. But it's not the actual thing that they're using in every breath to navigate their existence. And I think most people that convert to Islam, they approach Islam like, this is the map that I'm going to use for my every breath to navigate my existence. And that it's a process, and that there's a way to advance and to move from just Islam as an identity to Islam as a reality and a lived reality. And I'll give you a funny example. There's an American that I know, and a lot of Americans that convert to Islam, we have this very idealistic view of the Muslim world. We assume that it's like, if we go to the Muslim world, it's going to be like everybody is like the Sahaba, right? We just think everyone is righteous and pious, and there's no sinning, and there's no anything negative. And so this brother, American convert, he went to the Muslim world. He went to Egypt, I guess. I'll give it away, what country it is. Nothing against Egypt. I love Egyptians. But he left his bag in the mosque, and then he went to attend to something else, and he was speaking to people, and then he came back and his bag was gone. And then he went to his teacher, his Egyptian teacher, his sheikh, and he said, my bag got stolen. And then his sheikh said, well, why'd you leave it? He said, well, I'm in the Muslim world, I'm in the mosque. I thought it'd be safe. Everyone's Muslims here. And he said, his sheikh said to him, he said, you need to learn to differentiate between Muslims and mu'min. Muslim is a superficial identity in certain ways. But a mu'min is someone who it's actually penetrated their heart. The reality of it has penetrated their heart. And they start to live their life according to the understanding that if I steal, I'm going to feel the repercussions of this. That I'm going to be held accountable. And we know that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ also defined in the hadith of Jibril, which we all heard since probably you were young children, that the angel Gabriel came in the form of a man and asked the Prophet ﷺ to define Islam, Iman, and Ihsan. So this deen has dimensionality. There's Islam, there's Iman, and Ihsan. And that Ihsan level is to worship Allah as if you see Him, and if you don't see Him, to know that He sees you. So one of the things that I'd like to really have as a takeaway is that there's Islam as an identity, which is not a bad thing, by the way. It's beautiful. But it's the surface. And the goal is to move to Islam as a lived reality that transforms your experience. And I'll give you a good example because, and I'm sure this is the case here, but in America, now in the Muslim community, because I make music and do poetry, you see that there's like a lot of Muslim artists. But I'll just talk about hip hop because that's the art that I make. And there's kind of two extremes. There's Muslims that make hip hop, but it sounds like the shake it in the club, booty shaking, bust a cap. Like they're talking about the same things. You know, like T-Pain is a Muslim. Did you know that? You know T-Pain? But anyway, the point is they're Muslim, but it's not really informing their art at all. Right? Maybe they have a Muslim name, but it's not. And then on the other hand, you have people that are very Muslim, Like their whole thing is like, hey, I pray 5 times a day. Yay! But again, the thing is on that extreme, it's not very skilled. It's like nursery rhymes. It's not like they're mastering their craft. It's not like the average non-Muslim that listened to that would be like, wow, this is amazing. It's for the children, which is fine too. There's nothing wrong with that. But again, it's kind of superficial identity. Whereas, I would offer that there are those that have a middle way, which they may not even say anything about Islam outwardly. But the meaning of their words, the message of their words, people like Mos Def, who many of you know, Yasin Bey, or Lupe Fiasco, people like Amir Suleiman, who I believe has come here, people who their Islam may be more subtle, but they're really carrying that prophetic message in a way that speaks to the people because it's a reality that they live. So there's a few stories that I'd like to tell from some of the great scholars of our tradition that illustrate this reality about moving from Islam as a superficial identity and differentiating, as this Egyptian sheikh said, between Muslims and mu'min, right? Two of the great scholars of our ummah are Imam Ghazali and Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi. Most of you have probably heard of them. And they're two people who have similar stories, even though they're quite different. Both of them were scholars of the outward. They were teachers of the Sharia, of the sacred law. But both of them came to a crisis point. Imam Ghazali is interesting. He lived about 100 or so years before Maulana Rumi. And he was like the greatest scholar at the Nidhamiyya, which was like the Cambridge or Harvard of the world, right? At this time, the Muslim world had the leading colleges, right? So people from other parts of the world would go, like people from Europe would come to Andalusia to study, just like now the top brains in the Muslim world, now they go to America or Cambridge and things to study. But then the Muslims had the top institutions. And the top professor at the top college in the world was Imam Ghazali. And he was such an amazing speaker. And he was a great debater as well. He liked to debate. And he would have his whole lecture hall filled with turbaned scholars, turbaned ulama, sitting at his feet to learn. But he came to this point where he realized that he had been talking about it, but he himself had doubts. In other words, if we use this map analogy, we go back to this. He had been teaching the map. And he had been walking on the path as well, but he had never reached the destination. So he was teaching other people about the destination, about the map and where it leads, but he had never actually walked the path. Because as we know, the map is not the terrain. The map is not the terrain. And a lot of people can know a lot about Islam, but not be living it. And so that's what Imam Ghazali writes. He wrote an autobiography in which he says, basically, I was talking about it, but I wasn't living it. And he realized, too, that the only way to live it was for him to stop his professorship. Because he realized that his ego was getting larger and larger with every lecture. Because everybody was sitting there and, wow, how brilliant he is and how eloquent he is. And that the very essence of the spiritual path is to remove arrogance and to see yourself as less and not more. And so what he was doing, even though everyone was praising him, you're serving Allah, it's so great that you're a scholar, that was the very thing that was actually veiling him from Allah. And so he disappeared, essentially. He told his employer that he was going on Hajj, which he was. But what he didn't tell them is he wasn't going to come back. And in those days, because he was world famous, but even if you were world famous in those days before Facebook and Instagram, right? People would know your name, but they wouldn't know your face. And we forget that now because anybody who's famous, we've seen their face before we see them in person. So he could basically wear the clothes of a beggar and leave Baghdad and go to Damascus and go to Jerusalem and go to Mecca and Medina, and nobody would know him. So he lived the life essentially of a beggar. They said he swept the floor in the Umayyad mosque for a living. And in that time, he engaged in khalwa and seclusion and prayer. He said he reached the destination. And then he had yaqeen, he had certainty that this deen is real. That the path leads to where the prophets and the awliya said it would lead. And then he wrote the book called the Ihya Ulumuddin, which many consider, if not the greatest, one of the greatest gems of the Islamic tradition, one of the greatest books ever written. And in that, he separates between ilm al-mu'amila and ilm al-mukashifa. This is important for the note takers. This is important. Ilm al-mu'amila and ilm al-mukashifa. Ilm al-mu'amala is from amal. We all know that, which means action or works or deeds. Ilm al-mukashifa is from the word kashf, many of you know, which literally means unveiling. And a way to look at it is, he says, basically, when we study Islam, how to pray, how to fast, and not just the outward things, but even the inward things, when we learn about not being arrogant, not seeing yourself as better than anyone, when we learn about having patience and sabr, when we learn about understanding that Allah is in control of all things, and to have adab with everything that Allah puts in our life, when we study that, that's actually all kind of outward knowledge. That's like studying the map, right? It's studying the map, but it's not going to the destination. So actually walk the path and you find the river, that's a type of kesh because it's unveiled. And then you'll see a bridge over the river. But be careful not to take the first bridge, take the second bridge, etc. So the whole deen and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then those who came after him of his true inheritors, amongst the Sahaba and amongst his blessed family, and then the true inheritors, the scholars and the awliya, they are the ones who actually walk the path. And they commented on the map so that those of us who come after could actually walk it. So, Imam al-Ghazali wrote the Ihya, which is 40 books. And he says, this book that I'm writing is all ilm al-mu'amala. Because you can't really write about mukashafa. Because anything you say about kashf necessarily mixes truth with falsehood. And he gives an analogy. He says, if you were to try to describe honey to someone who had never tasted honey, no matter what you said, would never give them the taste of it. No matter how well you described it, it would never give them the taste of it. So what ilm mu'amala is not going to describe the taste of honey, but it's going to describe how to get to it. How to get to the honey, the hive and the honeycomb, and to reach your hand in without getting stung by the bees, and how to put the honey on your tongue. And ilm mukashifa is tasting that. So anything I tell you, anything I tell someone who's never tasted honey, it will always mix truth with falsehood because it will never give them the taste of honey. So I think this is important because Islam can become, for a lot of people, talking about the taste of honey, but not actually tasting the honey. And I think in our times it's incredibly important that we revive that. I'll be very quick in the story of Rumi, because Rumi is the #1 selling poet in America, and he is the means that I became Muslim, because I was a poet and a writer, and I was reading his work, which spoke to me. And what spoke to me about Maulana Rumi is that he wasn't saying, just believe. He was saying, you have to taste the honey. And so in his poetry, it made me want to taste the honey. Okay, what is he tasting? I want to know about that. And how that happened for him is he was a great scholar of the Hanafi madhab. No, most people are Shafi'i here, but in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, Hanafi. And one day he was teaching a bunch of students by a river from a book, and in those days all the books were handwritten, right? Who here has been to the Islamic Museum of Malaysia? We had a great tour a few days ago, and all those books are handwritten. They were very expensive. They took months to actually be written, sometimes a year or so. And Rumi was teaching a very important lesson on fiqh, and this wandering dervish comes in and grabs the book from his hands and throws it in the river and says, when are you going to stop talking about it and start living it? And Rumi's students got up and got upset and said, how dare you talk to our teacher like that? Well, Rumi started crying, and he said, he's right. And this was the iconic meeting with Shamsa Tabriz. And so again, in the interest of time, I won't tell the whole story, but you can look into it. There's many beautiful stories about the relationship between Rumi and Shams. But what Shams gave Rumi is the ability to actually explore the destination of the path and not just study the map, not just talk about the map. I want to leave time for questions. I've already been speaking quite a while, but I just wanted to say a little bit about the idea of relationships, relating to purpose. In the Ihya of Imam al-Ghazali, he has 40 books. And of course, he has a book that relates to what we would assume a Muslim scholar would write about. He has a book of prayer, and a book of fasting, and a book of zakat, and a book of pilgrimage. And he shows the purpose of prayer and fasting and pilgrimage and all these things. They're not just to go through the motions, but they're prescriptions that Allah has given us to illuminate our heart, to transform our heart, to allow us to taste, to allow us to draw near. And he shows how to do that. But what's most beautiful to me about the Ihya is then he has a book on friendship. And he has a book on marriage. And he has a book on food. And he talks about all these things which we may consider mundane aspects of existence. And he relates them all to the human heart and how to purify our heart. And in essence, he's saying nothing is not part of your spiritual path. And if you approach it in the right way, which you must, it will be a means for you to draw near. It will be a means for you to illuminate your heart. What our scholars actually tell us, if you really get down to it, is that there is no 3 relationships. That all those 3 things are facets of one relationship. They're all really one relationship. And to have adab, we talk about adab with our elders or our teachers or our brothers or our sisters, that really, this is just adab with Allah. Really, the true adab is adab in your heart with Allah. And there's 2 hadith that illustrate this beautifully. Many of you know the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and our mother Aisha. The Prophet ﷺ slaughtered a goat and then cooked it. And then he gave out the meat to people in Medina. And he gave out so much meat until all there was left was one shoulder. And Aisha, right, because she's in the household, So she's like, I'm glad you're being generous, Ya Rasulullah, but are you going to leave some for us? So she says, Ya Rasulullah, all we have left is the shoulder. And his response is so profound. He said, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he said, no, Aisha, now we have everything except the shoulder. Now we have everything. And this, again, if we look at it with that hadith of ihsan, to worship Allah as if you see Him, and if you don't see Him, know that He sees you. It's a high maqam to see that really what we have is what we give. And to see that truly what you do to another person is what's done to you. Right? And that if I was to speak ill of my brother or my sister or backbite someone, right? We have these great stories in our tradition that a man heard that there was someone that was backbiting, speaking ill of him behind his back. And so he came to this man and he gave him a precious gift. And this man said, why'd you give me a gift? I've been speaking bad about you this whole time. And he said, you've been giving me a gift this whole time because you've been taking my bad deeds from me on Yawm al-Qiyamah. They're going to be for you. What greater gift could you give? And of course, this is like a funny story, but it's also a reality. If we have Iman, then this is a reality. And that this should inform the way we operate in the world. It's not just a story we hear that's nice. It's not just a map that we look at. But in every moment when we think about potentially saying something about someone that would displease them if they were there, we stop. Because we understand that even if we don't see their good deeds, our good deeds rather, being taken and given to them, and their sins being taken and given to us, that it's a reality. Even if we can't see it, that it's a reality. So this shows that what we do to others, we do to ourselves. And this is Tawheed, real Tawheed. La ilaha illallah. There is no God but God. And that means that everyone is a creation of Allah. And that what we do to others, we're doing to ourselves in the highest estimation. And then there's the beautiful hadith Qudsi in which Allah says on the tongue of the Prophet ﷺ, it's a beautiful story about a man who dies. And then he goes into the divine presence and stand before Allah. And Allah says to him, I was sick and you didn't visit me. And he said, how can I visit you and you're the Lord of the worlds? And he said, and Allah responded, my servant was sick. And if you would have visited him, you would have found me with him. And then Allah said, I was hungry and you didn't feed me. And he said, how can I feed you? And Allah and if you would have fed him, you would have found me with him. And the hadith, of course, goes on. But the profound reality that this shows is that what we do to others, we're actually doing to Allah. And of course, there's a nuance there because there's no way to harm Allah. There's no way, right? But the reality that this relationship that we see, our relationship with others, is not at all separate from our relationship with Allah. And that if we are acting in a way that is unbecoming of a true servant of Allah, then this indicates that there is something wrong with our relationship to Allah, even if we're acting it out with other people. So, again, we talk about living our purpose, finding meaning. The first question we could ask, even though I'm asking it as the last question before I sit down, is what is the purpose of existence? Is it to be happy, right? Finding happiness. Is it to be successful, rich and famous? That'd be nice, right? But is that really the purpose? And I'll close with this. Again, wasallam, there was a man whose whole life was suffering. Whole life was suffering. And when he died, Allah in the Jannah for just like this, just to dip in, and then took him out and asked him, had he ever known pain? And the man said, no. All my whole life was joy. And then there was a man whose whole life was ease and luxury. And he died. And he was dipped in the fire, just like that. And again, from our limited perspective, we don't necessarily know how the story ends. All of us, right? If you watch a movie about a love story, right? Bollywood. All the Bollywood movies are exactly the same script. Seems to me, at least. Right? Poor boy meets rich girl. Right? He can't marry rich girl because he's a poor boy. But then somehow he finds out actually he was a prince that was adopted, and he finds his real family, and then they can be together. But see, if you're watching the movie and you don't know how it ends, we all know how love stories, they always end happy. But if you didn't know it ends happy and you're watching it and you see this sad, these people love each other but they can't be together for various circumstances, then it's sad. And it's torment and it's torture. If you identify with them, you cry. But if you know the end of the story, and that they come together in the end, then all that struggle that they go through, all the pain, all the tears, it actually just makes the story that much more beautiful, right? And many of us know if we look back at the hard times in our life, when it turned out okay, we actually look back on it with a type of happiness, a type of sweetness, right? We all know those elders of ours that say, back in my day, we had to walk to school 10 miles uphill both ways, right? But they say it like they're so happy. That, okay, it was a struggle then, but it's a type of joy because they lived through it. And that's the thing that I would encourage myself and others to keep in mind. That life can get really difficult. Even for the most average life. Everybody that we love gets sick and dies. Or we get sick and die before them. You know, and the most average life has such a great degree of suffering. It's true. But if we keep in mind the end of the story, and if we keep our hope in Allah and not in ourselves, then it gives us a type of ability to look at this love story. It is a love story. What's the first thing that Allah created? Right? Allah was a hidden treasure that loved to be known. So they say He created the light of the Prophet ﷺ, someone that could know Him, the most perfect knower. And then from that He created the qalam and the lawh, the pen and the pad, so that He could write a love story to the Prophet ﷺ. And then from that He created the whole existence, which is the love story. So we get to take part in this love story. And sometimes there's difficulties and trials and tribulations, but if we read the Quran and we listen to the stories of the Prophet ﷺ, they're telling us that it ends good in the end. That the lovers are united in the end, in the highest levels of paradise. And so the struggles and trials and tribulations in this world, in this movie that we're in, that they can actually take on a type of sweetness for those who move from Islam to Iman and eventually to Ihsan. Forgive me for speaking so long. Maybe if anyone has questions, we can discuss. Jazakallah khair.
Okay, same thing. as per usual, opening the floor for questions. If you have any written down ones, just put your hand up and we'll come and get it from you.
Assalamu alaikum. First, thank you so much for your presentation. I've learned a lot from it, and something that I've been wondering, I know it's pretty complex, but how would you suggest that we would know when we're living by the map and not just speaking of the map?
Wow, that's a great question. The first thing that came to mind is a story that I heard from Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad, T.J. Winter, who's a great British Muslim scholar. And he was essentially saying a similar thing in different words. He was saying that for a lot of Muslims, Islam has just become little more than like superstition. And he gave this example. He said, if you go to the Muslim world, a lot of people, they'll have like the Quran hanging from their dashboard, or like the names of Allah, or some beads, dhikr beads. And he says, but then he gives the example getting in a taxi and he has the Quran hanging, but then he's weaving through traffic and he's cursing at people and he's Ya Hamad, he's calling people donkey and this and that, right, as he's driving. And Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad mentioned how ironic that is, because the whole message of the Quran is that Allah is in control of all things. And you're only going to be asked about what you have control over. You're not going to be asked about the person that cuts you off in traffic. But you are going to be asked how you respond. Did you call him a donkey? Did you call him a donkey in your heart, even if you didn't say it out loud? Right? So, really, living, like, walking the path is catching yourself wanting to call him a donkey and saying, and not. Or even saying it and then saying, astaghfirullah. And checking in with your heart and realizing, because we all do, like, oh man, I got overcome in that state by anxiety or by whatever, jealousy, right? Even to notice that it's happening. For instance, Imam Ghazali tells a story in the Ihya of a man who was always in the front row of prayer in the mosque. Very known as just a righteous, pious man in his community, always gets there early and always in the front row. One day he slept in past his time, and he's running to the mosque late, and he gets there, and he's towards the back. And it makes him so upset internally. And then all of a sudden he realizes that he's upset not just for Allah, but he's upset because of his ego, of his reputation in the community. And so he notices that, and because he was a sincere, he said, I have to make up all my prayers for the last 20 years. Because they were afflicted with this hidden shirk, right? This hidden concern. It wasn't just for Allah, it was for other people. So of course that's an extreme example to say make up your prayers for the last 20 years. But it also shows that when people are sincere with themselves, that even though they make mistakes, they will realize it happening inside themselves. And they will course correct. So even asking this question is a good thing. I was with a friend of mine, and with a great Muslim scholar, Habib Omar bin Hafid, who many of people are students of. And my friend, Abdul Sabur, he's an American convert, and he said, how do we know if we're sincere? He was like, I'm worried I'm not sincere. And Habib Omar, like, my friend was really worried, like, how do I know if I'm sincere? And Habib answered, he goes, the fact that you're asking that question and that you're concerned, that means you're sincere. That's a good sign. So, it's really just this kind of self-checking also. And taking that, the path is your path. And again, this is another thing like the convert, each person who's born Muslim has to have a moment where they decide this isn't just the religion I was brought up in. This isn't just what my parents taught me. This isn't just what I learned in Islamic school or whatever, but this is going to be my relationship. And when you have that moment, and I'm sure everybody here has had that moment, I think that essentially you're a convert too. That was your conversion moment, where you realize I'm not just going to have Islam be my superficial identity, but I'm going to have it be my path. So in that sense, that's a conversion moment as well. So I don't know if I answered your question.
Assalamu alaikum. How long ago you became a Muslim and why? Because your depth of religion, Islam, is very good.
Jazakallah khair. You have a good opinion of me. Ameen. I became Muslim 12 years ago, about almost 13 now. And as converts, we get asked that question a lot, so we have like about 20 versions of the story, just depending on, we have the 5-minute version, the 10-minute version, the 3-hour version. I'll give you the short version, but essentially the city that I grew up in is actually the least church-going city in America. Very few people go to church. And I was like that too. People assume, I wasn't raised Christian. I was raised with no religion, actually. My father was raised Catholic, my mother Protestant, but my father had a bad experience in Catholic school. Right? The nuns were always beating them. Really? It is funny, but for him, when he got older, he said, I don't want my children to be exposed to that. He didn't speak ill of religion, but he actually forbid my mother from even taking us to church, even though she wanted to, because she had positive experiences on Easter and Christmas, but he said, no, I don't want them to experience that. So I literally had no religion. But again, I didn't have people telling me that God is not real. I just had no input. I really grew up like as much on a desert island as you could imagine as far as that. So when I came of age, I started asking, because I wasn't given a map, you could say. So I started looking at the different maps, different religions, and I started asking, I started looking at religions like a buffet, So I said like, okay, the Buddhists do meditation, I'll try a little bit of that. From the Hinduism, I'll take yoga, I like a little bit of that. From Islam, I like the Sufi poetry, I take a little bit of that. And, et cetera, et cetera. But my door to Islam was two ways. One was through Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz. Who knows who that is? Malcolm X, more popularly known. If anybody hasn't read the autobiography of Malcolm X, that's your homework that I'm giving you. I'm just kidding, but I promise it will change your life. It's sad to go a whole life and not read that book. You can watch the movie by Spike Lee, but the book is better. The movie's good too, but read the book. And you'll want to read it because it's about his time as a criminal and a pimp and selling drugs and going to prison and real stuff, and then his transformation. So I read that, and that affected me. And particularly, I grew up in a very multicultural city in America, and so I had friends from all backgrounds. And among African American people in America, Islam is very prominent. Every black person in America has like a cousin who's Muslim, right? And, names like Muslim names are very common. And there's this, and it's because of Malcolm, it's because of the Nation of Islam, it's because of people like Muhammad Ali. And so through that, I knew a lot of black Muslims, and through hip-hop music that I was making. And they always embodied this idea that Islam is about standing for justice, standing up for the poor and the oppressed. And so I always, from that, had a deep respect for Islam. And then at the other hand, I grew up in Seattle, which is a very left-leaning city of grunge, but it's also a city of like a lot of hippies and counterculture and stuff like that. So I was exposed to, a lot of Eastern religions, Eastern spirituality. And because I was also a writer, I got really into Sufi poetry. And so, particularly Rumi and others, but what I saw through that is that what really spoke to me is that Islam has the kind of social justice of Malcolm X, standing for justice, working in the world, but it also has this deep well of spirituality. It has this emphasis on your personal relationship with the beloved, Allah the beloved. And so for me, that's what I needed. I needed something that was about action in the world and not just going and meditating and leaving in a cave and leaving the world, but was about meditating in the cave, like the Prophet ﷺ, but then returning to the world and acting in the world. And so it was really, Rakim and Rumi. It was hip-hop and Sufism that drew me to Islam.
So thank you for sharing. I was wondering, two things I would like to ask. One is you were talking about the map and walking the map. So as an average Muslim, not a Muslim scholar or whatever, how do we know that? At what point do we? Because we can't just keep quiet and just. I'm not going to say anything to others until I've done it. So do we just keep quiet and let ourselves stay quiet until we become a walking billboard of proper Muslim life before we actually talk to people about the map? Or can we do both simultaneously? And the second question is, you were sharing your experience about Catholic school and how made some people apathetic to religious schools. So in certain, like here in Malaysia as well, we have schools that are trying to inculcate Islamic values. So how do we avoid falling into that trap of the Catholic school, getting Muslim youth who are actually more put off with Islam rather than liking it more? Thank you.
Inshallah, that's a good question. The first thing that comes to mind on your first question is again from Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad. He said, use words in your da'wah only when absolutely necessary. The true people that, and we should, it's of course example, especially now, like in America, like people don't want to hear, right? Like people roll their eyes at people. You've probably seen in the movies, if you haven't been to America, there's people that stand on the street corner with the end is near signs, People think about people that kind of like preach religion as like insane, like there's something wrong with you. And in a sense, at least in America, culturally, it's just not good adab. And maybe that's part of just being in a multicultural society where it's like you shouldn't try to, but again, it's example. Like you say, it's example. Now that doesn't mean you can't speak about it. And we share what we know. And everything that I share today, it's not like I claim to be like, I've reached the summit of the destination of where Islam leads and I'm coming down from the mountain to tell you. It's like, no, I'm trying on the path and I fall a lot. And maybe that's my expertise, is falling a lot, or is taking the wrong way a lot. So I know the map pretty well now. I'm learning it because I took so many wrong turns and still am. See? So it's not about being perfect. And that's really another thing that's so important in our day and age because, and this relates to your second question, that I travel around and a lot of young Muslims, they have like a deep guilt and they've been taught like, okay, one time in high school you did this and that, so you're going to hell for sure. They've been taught this kind of fire and brimstone, judgmental version of who God is. And that affects their reality in so many ways, right? Similarly, like my dad in Catholic school. And, how does that come through when, it affects kids. If you're teaching kids Quran and Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and then you're beating them. Ar-Rahman, Ir-Rahim, beat someone. The all-merciful, the all-compassionate, bam! Right? I mean, it's funny, but it's not funny. People are going to be asked about that. And I think we have to move to like less of this societally judgmental to see like we're all on the path together. A community is supposed to support each other. You know? It's like that hadith that if there was a people that never sinned, Allah would get rid of them. That's not what we're doing here. Allah would get rid of them and create a people that would sin and then make tawbah. Sin and then make tawbah. That's what Bani Adam is. Allah had angels that worshipped Him perfectly. Many that never left sajda for thousands of years. But then Allah created Adam. And the angels themselves didn't understand. They said, will you create one who will sow discord and shed blood upon the earth? And Allah's answer is amazing. Surah Al-Baqarah. Because Allah didn't say yes or no. But Allah said, I know that which you know not. In other words, there's a secret in it. And that secret is our free will. That if we actively choose to submit, that if we actively make the choice to turn to Allah, then we actually can surpass the angels. Because the angels didn't have the choice. The angels will stand in awe of the one who wakes up the last third of the night to make sajda. Because they didn't have a choice to make sajda. This person does. So, one of my best friends named Nuri Friedlander, he's a brilliant man. His father's a convert to Islam. And Nuri just got his PhD from Harvard in Islamic studies. Brilliant and deeply spiritual. And it's interesting, the children of converts, because there's many of the children of converts, they don't really care so much about Islam. Even like the Muslim scholars you see in America, big convert scholars, their kids are like, yeah, whatever. And they can just go back into normal society. They look like everybody else, and no one really know. Maybe they have a weird name, a Muslim name. And so I asked him, Nuri, I said, mashallah, your father's a convert, you were raised Muslim, and you have such a beautiful, you're so intelligent and spiritually so beautiful. Like, what was it about how your father raised you that you turned out like this? And he said, you know what? My father was very gentle with me. And what he did was he just told me the stories of the awliya. He said, my superheroes growing up were the saints of Islam, were the prophets. Those were my superheroes. I knew all their stories. My father would tell me for hours. So he didn't tell me so much, do this, don't do this. He just told me all their stories. And then once a week, he made me come to the zawiyah for dhikr. Even if I didn't sit still, even if I ran around with the other kids, he just made me be there. That was the only thing he said. Once a week you have to. This is the age that we're in. The age of like this fear-based Islam. It's over. I'm sorry. You have to make people love it. You have to make people taste it. And so I think this is, in our age, is that it's always the age of muhabba. It's always the time of love, but especially now. That if people don't taste it, the love, it's very difficult to hold on in this age. Thank you.